Welcome to Folkways, the Folklore of Britain and Ireland podcast. Hello, welcome to the show. Today we're heading to the mysterious windswept shores of the Isle of Iona. Enjoy. The Isle of Iona lies off the western coast of Scotland, a slip of land just over 3 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. The island is known for its crystal waters, shifting from aquamarine to emerald greens. The shallow waters near the shore are often clear, revealing white sandy seabeds, giving a tropical appearance despite the harsh northern climate. As well as its rugged coastlines, cliffs and caves, the island is home to wildflower meadows, damp boggy moorland and grazing pastures divided by ancient stone walls. The island of Iona is probably best known as being the cradle of Christianity in Scotland. Iona is where the Irish Saint Columba from Donegal arrived in 563 with just 12 followers. Here, he established a monastery that would spread Christianity across these westerly isles. It was here on Iona that illuminated manuscripts were created, one of the most famous being the Book of Kells, an elaborately decorated work that was later moved to Ireland, where it famously now resides in Dublin. But it all started here on Iona. Folklore surrounding St. Columba himself is notable and includes stories of his deep connection to nature and the supernatural. One tale recounts how he banished a water beast from the river Ness, often cited as one of the earliest references to Nessie. Other accounts speak of his visions of angels and prophecies about the spiritual significance of Iona. Despite repeated Viking raids, the monastery remained a revered site, and its legacy endures through the ruins preserved on the eastern part of the island. Surrounding the abbey are burial grounds, ancient crosses and stone carvings, which today you can walk amongst. Just south of Iona Abbey lies the fascinating St. Oran's Chapel and Graveyard, the resting place of the early kings of Scotland. It is said that 48 Scottish kings are buried here, including some legendary figures such as Kenneth MacAlpin, the first king of Scotland. As well as the island's Christian links, it is this, the knowledge of all these sleeping kings here, on this small slip of land out at sea, that continues to draw people to the island today. We can imagine the arduous journey these ancient kings might have taken to get here. Perhaps we can picture the solemn procession across the waves. On mainland Scotland, there is a half-forgotten route known as the Road of the Kings, running all the way down to Glen Lownan. This is a beautiful, imposing, mountain-crowned glen filled with ancient standing stones and cairns. Once walked through, never forgotten. The king's body, having been brought down through Glen Lownan, was likely at the Rock of the Dead, then transferred to a boat and sailed across, first to the Isle of Mull and then onto Iona. Once here, on Iona, the final, most sacred stretch of the journey followed the ancient Street of the Dead. This street, Strajna Marav in Gaelic, leads from Martyrs Bay up towards Iona Abbey. It is still visible today as a worn stone path that you can follow. Alongside it, there are ancient grave markers, including medieval slabs with intricate carvings. Chronicles mention that, as well as the 48 Scottish kings, 4 Irish kings and 8 Norwegian kings were buried on Iona also. Even though many of the royal graves are unmarked or lost, the tradition of Iona as a royal necropolis certainly adds to its atmosphere and appeal. It's hard to grasp the magnitude of historical significance of this peaceful place, just how much its landscape has seen. At twilight, just out of the corner of your eye, you may sometimes think you see a procession of feet winding along the street of the dead, only to blink again and find yourself quite alone. It's important to add that today, sacred journeys to the island are still being made. For our own many reasons, to this place, those still living come to stand above the dead as we gaze out to sea. It was this landscape, with its ghosts of Viking raiders and forever sleeping kings, that, in the late summer of 1929, a young woman travelled to. She was wrapped in a strange, handmade type of cloak and had brought many items with her across the sea, including a chair, typewriter, and various pieces of occult paraphernalia. The young woman dragged her items off the boat and onto Iona's shores. She had arrived. You're listening to Season 4, Episode 5, Mysterious Isle. By all accounts, Marie Norah Emily Fornario had not had a great start to life. Norah, as she was known, was born in Cairo in 1897. While just an infant, her English mother died. Her Italian father, Giuseppe Fornario, sent her to live with her maternal grandparents, Thomas and Emily Ling, in England. Here, she resided in Streatham for her early years. Even as a young adult, Norah was curiously frail. She had thick, dark hair under which bright and searching eyes shone out. She appeared hungry to belong. Cut off from her parents, one through death, the other through location, she wanted to find her place in the world. Left to be raised by her grandparents, Norah Fornario of Streatham was drawn to mysticism and esoteric practices from a notably young age. Her interests were not passing, but rather encompassed a range of occult disciplines which she took very seriously, including such activities as that of mastering telepathy, channeling energies, and an overall profound interest in fairy folklore. After some involvement in different occult groups, in only her mid-20s, Norah was invited to join the Alpha and Omega, an offshoot of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn, as you may well know, being a society dedicated to the study and practice of the occult and boasting quite the alumni. Norah would spend her time honing her skills, and to great effect, according to fellow occultist Dion, who had the following to say about the young Norah Fornario.
I knew Miss Fornario intimately, and at one time we did a good deal of work together. But we went our separate ways and lost sight of each other. She was half Italian and half English, an unusual intellectual calibre, and was especially interested in the green ray elemental contacts, too much interested in them for my peace of mind, and I became nervous and refused to cooperate with her. I do not object to reasonable risks. In fact, one cannot expect to achieve anything worthwhile in life if one will not take risks. But it appeared to me that she was going into very deep waters, and that there was certain to be trouble sooner or later.
Norah Fornario wrote extensively, and her work was regarded as being of a very high standard, marrying a vivid imagination with an exceptional command of the English language. As Ben Oakley writes in Death on Iona, Norah Fornario is perhaps one of Britain's great lost intellects. If she had lived longer, then we might know her name better, but more on that later. Of particular note is an essay that the young Anglo-Italian wrote on the role of the imagination, of which the following is just an extract.
The artist's imaginative faculty is frequently in need of training and discipline, for unless it is balanced by clear reason, it is apt to distort the spiritual truths it strives to express, instead of embodying them in beautiful and helpful form.
Let me just read that again. The artist's imaginative faculty is frequently in need of training and discipline, for unless it is balanced by clear reason, it is apt to distort the spiritual truths it strives to express, instead of embodying them in beautiful and helpful form. Norah argues in this essay that, through correct application, that the imagination is a spiritual tool. It is only its misuse that sees us falling into distraction and confusion, but if correctly trained and paired with discipline and intellect, as we heard, the imagination can be used to no less than unite us with God. Our imaginative eye, the beauty and the shapes we can create, are our access to our human interpretation of the divine. I encourage you to read her essay in full. It's of a special interest if you have an artistic practice of any form. At the very least, it serves to highlight that today, the word imagination is often brandished as a pejorative, if you noticed, i.e., they've got a rather active imagination, as essentially a way of calling someone delusional or a liar. It is opposed to truth here, interestingly. And you'll see this yourself. An imagination is often denigrated in adulthood. It's a flaw, something of the nursery to be put away once we enter the real world. I've taken a bit of time to highlight Norah's writing because her intelligence and what we might call vision are rarely mentioned adequately enough in her story. Blog articles and podcasts covering Norah Fornario increasingly portray her as some kind of watery lost hippie of the early 20th century, barely able to string a sentence together. But her work, if you read it properly, tells a different story, as does her being a member of such occult orders as the Alpha and Omega by only her mid-20s. In fact, it was actually that Norah was a little too dedicated that seemed to worry fellow occultist Dion Fortune. As we heard, Dion wrote that Norah was going a little bit too deep in aspects of her studies, at which point Dion cut all contact with the young woman. There was something in Norah's eyes beneath that thick, dark hair that had begun to scare her. At age 29, Norah had severed herself from all occult orders, continuing her own studies solitarily in London. As Dion Fortune had noted, Norah was particularly interested in what occult orders of this time called green ray elementals. So this is a study very involved and layered, but just to succinctly say that we might translate green ray elementals as non-human intelligences of the natural world. Earth spirits, we could simplify further. Through her own writings, we can see that Dion Fortune believed that this was just one area of knowledge on an initiate's path, the goal being to balance this with knowledge of other disciplines. One should not linger just here for too long. As we heard, it was Dion's opinion that as Norah had grown older, she'd become fixated on these green ray elementals. Dion then suggested that it was actually dangerous to be out of balance in this way. One was not meant to wander off into the dusk towards the ancient hills and fairy forts forever, towards that primal force found sweeping the edges of the moors. But Norah Fornario was already slipping away. It wouldn't be long until her unmoving body was found on a remote Scottish island, the tendrils of her dark hair being whipped by the Hebridean winds. Some of the mystery of Norah's next move from southern England can perhaps be explained through two figures who greatly influenced the young woman. One was Dundee-born artist John Duncan, born 30 years before Norah. He, somewhat famously, claimed to have heard fairy music whilst painting. He sincerely believed that this was music from another realm. If you don't know him by name, John Duncan, if you search for his work, you will likely recognise it. Firmly part of the Celtic revival, as we now call it, he is known for painting folkloric and mythological scenes. Whilst clearly pre-Raphaelite rooted, there's a curious Art Nouveau graphical quality to his work. John Duncan was quite fixated with this other world that he felt that he had access to. At the dawning of the 20th century, he actively sought to reconnect audiences with what he saw as a lost heritage. He wanted to reacquaint people with their mythic origins, a mission that he felt he had received directly from the fairy realm itself. Take a look at his piece Riders of the Sidhe, S-I-D-H-E, from 1911, and I'll let you ponder what some of the aspects of this heritage might be, and depending on your own reaction, whether he was successful. She being, of course, the Scottish or Irish fairies. Unfortunately, John Duncan did not have the happiest of lives and was not necessarily appreciated in his time by the broader art world. His work faced biting criticism, being labelled as overly romantic, nostalgic, and detached from modern artistic progress. In later life, he said that his inner eye, as he called his otherworldly gift, that it had left him, that this was no longer his. On reviewing his life, he sadly seemed to think that he had failed in his artistic mission altogether, that mission to connect modern audiences to a more mythic way of thinking. But looking at how loved John Duncan's artwork is today, I would like to very respectfully disagree. One of the challenges of artistic pursuits is that you don't necessarily get to see the overall impact that your work has. Looking at what Duncan produced with his talents and the effect it would have on generations of unborn humans to come, I'd say that the fairies were pretty wise in picking him as their man. Someone else who might have disagreed with John Duncan's sad appraisal of his own work was someone going by the name of Miss Norah Fornario, who studied Duncan's life and work with great interest. The fairy painter from Dundee who heard mystical tunes whilst at the easel. Norah was particularly curious to learn of his relationship with a place called the Isle of Iona, which had made its way into his work and to where he was a regular visitor. On one trip to the isle, he wrote,
Iona, dear and lovely as ever. Didn't paint, of course.
Norah noted the location. The second influence on the young woman came in the form of Fiona Macleod, pen name of one William Sharp, a prolific writer who had recorded an abundance of fairy lore. There was a curious connection between writer William Sharp and the just-mentioned painter John Duncan, with both men receiving help from Professor Patrick Geddes. Geddes published Sharp's work, whilst being a type of benefactor to Duncan. So this all took place during the time we now call the Celtic Revival or Celtic Twilight, the late 19th into early 20th century. A time when a small yet prominent and prolific enough group of people sought to highlight Britain and Ireland's mystical and fairy folklore, interest seen as quite regressive by the general mood of the time. So this was some of the context that the occult-obsessed young Norah Fornario came of age within. This group of people and their strange work, which matched her own interests so specifically, caught her eye. She devoured all of writer William Sharp's work that she could. In particular, she resonated with a play of his called The Immortal Hour, a symbolist drama regarding the tragic life of a fairy princess. The play explored the tension between the mortal world and what we could call a fairy or otherworldly realm. When The Immortal Hour ran in Regent's Theatre in 1923, Norah was noted as having been in the audience 23 times. That's 1 year, 23 times. Spellbound, sitting alone in the dark audience as she absorbed the sparkling colours on the lithe bodies moving across the stage. Norah was rather interested to learn that her hero writer, William Sharp, too, had repeatedly returned to an island called Iona, staying at the St. Columba Hotel. It is clear that Norah Fornario's interest in this mysterious isle was sufficiently piqued. Perhaps it held the answers that she too had been searching for all this time. In early 1929, as she kicked her heels around the streets of South London, quite alone and adrift from her former acquaintances, she realised that she had to find a way to get to the island. Iona, in 1929, was far from the modern conveniences of mainland Britain. Its sparse population was made up of crofters, fishers, and the keepers of Iona's storied abbey. For an outsider like Norah, life here would have been sharply contrasted with what she had previously known. She lodged with a family called the Camerons, renting a modest attic room at their croft. She spent her days writing at a typewriter, meditating, and taking short walks around the island. Though she would regularly take evening walks, keen to discover the island, she was not a fast mover and never strayed too far from the Camerons' door. She was recorded as wearing flowing dresses and wild accessories, quite at odds with the working islanders. However, accounts of those who witnessed her said that she was well liked and respected. The general understanding amongst the islanders was that this was a woman on some kind of a retreat. Of course, this is still a popular thing to do today for artistic or spiritual reasons. The express goal to get away from one's usual domestic routines. Iona had seen her fair share of seekers arrive after all, not to mention Norah's heroes John Duncan and William Sharp before her. The islanders got used to seeing the woman around, her unruly dark hair under that heavy cloak-like coat she wore. "Ah yes, the woman who lives at the Camerons," they would say in conversation with one another, as if it had always been so. When venturing outside, Norah would spend her time gently exploring the island's moors and beaches, often barefoot, and collecting stones, plants, and shells. Unsurprisingly, she was enchanted by the island's folklore, particularly its associations with fairies and the other world. Apart from the island's famous Christian connections, it held other associations, as what we call a thin place, which we might translate as liminal. Iona was a place that had the reputation as being between the worlds. Although Iona is famous for stories of its monks and buried kings, another aspect of its landscape should be mentioned. It possesses some prominent fairy hills, such as Shean Moor, a name that translates from the Gaelic as Great Fairy Mound. Then there's Doonee, the highest point on Iona, translating as either Fort of Iona or Fort of the Yew Tree. The climb to the summit of Doonee is a steep walk through heather-covered slopes, mossy rocks and patches of exposed granite. From the top, you're given sweeping views of the island, the surrounding Hebrides and even the nearby Isle of Mull on clear days. It is here, on Doonee, the Saint Columba is said to have had an angelic vision. Adding to its mystique, there's a small pool known as the Well of Eternal Youth at the summit. Calum Cameron was 12 years old when Norah Fornario came to stay in his family's croft. In a discussion with Richard Wilson in 1989, Calum, now in his 70s, had the following to say about his family's curious ex-lodger.
She took lonely walks at night to study the island. Sometimes the large ground mound of Fairy Hill, said to harbour the spirits of the pre-Christian dead. She kept her curtains closed. She kept 2 oil lamps that she kept burning in her room.
Life continued on for a few months without incident on the island, the inhabitants now quite used to the decoratively dressed woman with an English accent. They would nod to her as they passed her combing the beaches at twilight with feathers in her hair. As October bled into November of 1929, something started to shift. Norah's behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic. She would regularly spend days locked up in her attic room, claiming not to want to be disturbed. Calum Cameron noted,
She behaved like she was being hunted.
Beyond the November Hebridean winds that sometimes shook the windows, there was a strange pressure that seemed to be pressing down upon the Camerons' croft. It was all to do with the woman in the attic. One Sunday, she burst out of her room, pulling her suitcase down the stairs. She demanded that the Camerons must help her immediately to pack up the rest of her things and take her to the ferry. She had to get off the island, for she was in danger. She spoke of a rudderless ship crossing the horizon. What this meant was not clear. The Camerons informed her as calmly as they could that no ferries ran on Sundays and that she would have to wait until tomorrow. Through her perspiration, a strand of her dark hair was stuck to the hollow of one cheek, another plastered across her temple as she breathed heavily, trying to take this information in. By the evening, the Camerons had succeeded in calming Norah down, and she ate her dinner with them uneventfully. On Monday morning, Norah was gone. Calum Cameron recalled her last days. She was all right on the Sunday night, but when his sister took up breakfast to her room, there was a smell of burning, and the grate was filled with burned papers and pamphlets. The oil lamps near her typewriter were still alight. The bedclothes were turned down from the pillows. Nothing appeared to be missing. All her clothing was still there, and her watch, rings, and hairpins lay neatly on the dressing table. As Monday drew on and Norah did not return, a search was called. The islanders combed the land, especially the shoreline where the waves could be rough. By Tuesday morning, most of the island had been searched, and the theory of Norah having drowned was becoming more probable. By Tuesday afternoon, 2 crofters, Hector McLean and Hector McNiven, left the search to see to their animals. They stumbled on Norah's body around a mile from the Camerons' house. She was naked, her black cloak and a small knife nearby. On the top part of her feet there were many scratches, as if she'd been dragged the mile from the Camerons' house to here, on her toes. There must have been a logical explanation. Death by exposure, the coroner from the mainland concluded. Yet the details of Norah's final hours are curious and have become a more recent contribution to the island's substantial mythos. How had this woman, not known for her physical vitality, have found herself a mile from the Camerons' croft, having travelled in complete darkness and wearing no shoes? The strange and difficult logistics of Norah's journey should be noted. Not only did she have no shoes, but why was she wearing no clothes under that cloak? Had she left the croft in this way, willingly stepping out the Camerons' front door into the freezing darkness, or had items been discarded along the way? The only items she was found with were the aforementioned cloak, a small knife, and her usual silver cross around her neck, which notably had turned black. She was found in the vicinity of Loch Stannig, known locally as the domain of the She. Holes were found on the raised ground around her, it looking like she had tried with the knife to burrow into the earth. The Camerons played out the final exchanges with their ex-lodger on repeat. In the days before, as well as Norah's requests for privacy, the family noted her writing at a typewriter throughout the night. She seemed especially preoccupied, fixated on something that she had to get out onto the paper. On their way to bed each night, the family could hear the keys of the typewriter being hit, the sound continuing, muffled, for a long time after they'd closed their bedroom doors and sunk into their beds. Then there was the unexpected final request of that last afternoon, that Norah had to get off the island as she was in danger. Talk about a rudderless ship crossing the horizon, a riddle that could not be decoded. They thought again how Norah had left her bedroom. Lots of paper had been burnt in the grate. However, the rest of the room was tidy. As Calum Cameron said, the bedsheets had been turned down from the pillow, suggesting presence of mind enough to, at least, have neatly made the bed. Other than the burnt paper, the room did not suggest anything unusual. In time, it emerged that other islanders had seen something that night. There were reports of a cloaked figure in the vicinity of where Norah was found, as well as unexplained blue lights in the sky. Perhaps the most obvious answer to Norah's fate was that this was some kind of mental health episode meeting an unforgiving Hebridean night. Such an episode could explain the incorrect attire, knife, and seeming attempt to try to burrow into the ground. Perhaps the vision of that rudderless ship was the hallucinatory beginning of the events that led to her death. Whilst mental health difficulties could plausibly lead to the events of that night, it is Norah's strong occult interests that have added additional layers. A different interpretation is that Norah purposefully went out to perform some kind of ritual that evening, one last chance to connect with the land before her ferry sailed. It is unlikely her deeply held interests in those elementals had subsided during her time on Iona. Indeed, Calum Cameron notes she remained quite preoccupied with Shean Moor, the big fairy hill, containing what he called the spirits of the pre-Christian dead. Combining this interest with Norah's esoteric training, it's possible the woman had made substantial efforts to connect with what she saw as the island's non-human intelligences. Regarding how Norah was found, we should note it is not uncommon for magical rites to be performed naked. Looking at the knife, these can be used ritualistically to direct energy, contrary to their more grisly reputation in Hollywood movies. It is not clear what the holes in the ground around Norah were, only that it was likely she had made them herself. This may suggest that she was trying to ritualistically gain access to some presence she believed to be within the earth. We can only speculate, but whatever did happen, Dion Fortune's prophetic words linger behind. Norah was going too deep, and there was sure to be trouble sooner or later. Additional theories talk of third parties, foul play, and a Wicker Man-style plot by the islanders. However, there is no evidence of anyone else involved, and no one has ever been charged. It is of note that the cloaked figure that was reported nearby was likely Norah herself, wandering across the moors. In the coverage of Norah Fornario's story, one is often propositioned with the following type of question. Was Norah Fornario unwell, or was she some type of misunderstood genius? Norah's artistic hero, John Duncan, that fairy painter from Dundee, is curiously often summarised with that exact question too as a type of final remark on his work. Artistic genius versus madman. It's interesting that with both of these figures, Norah and John, there are only two options to choose from here, brilliant versus unwell, and that these options are positioned as being mutually exclusive. I just make that point for what it's worth. the young woman who froze to death whilst looking for fairies is now firmly wedded to the island and its lore. Everyone has their own theories of what happened that November night. Mental instability to Norah being spiritually or psychically attacked. The latter pointing to Norah's request of that final afternoon, that she had to get off of the island for she was in danger. This being interpreted as not a physical threat, but rather knowing Norah's proclivities as some form of spiritual assault. Some theories point to tensions within the occult circles Norah had frequented, and that she had been intentionally taken out. Other theories point to the spirits of Iona itself as being Norah's undoing. She was, after all, a stranger to the island without heritage, and that Iona's unseen guardians may not have appreciated the confidence and speed at which this ceremonially trained urbanite tried to make herself known. It should be stressed that the Scottish she-fairies are seen as dangerous to mortals. Traditionally, we see customs to guard against them, not to invite them in, an important distinction. Old wisdom says that one should respect the places of the she, their hills, their forts, that one should not trespass at all, but leave them well alone. Much like in Irish law, stories tell of those who do not acknowledge this boundary meeting a sticky ending. Then there's the theory, and one that tends to linger in the mind, that Norah actually succeeded in her goals to cross to another realm, that what happened that night was not an accident or an attack, but ultimately her aim. That through her extensive occult training, meeting Iona's liminality, that she had finally found a way to leave this plane and enter another. That, now banished from the world of flesh and blood, that her spirit still wanders Iona's shores, forever aged 33. Our opinion on the layers that make Norah Fornario's story will, of course, be shaped by our cosmological view of what is or isn't possible. Wherever we find ourselves falling, Norah's story remains of widespread appeal, the Anglo-Italian consumed with accessing different realms and her pilgrimage to a far corner of the British Isles to do so. As the centenary of Norah's death approaches, interest in her trip to Iona only continues to grow. As time has passed, she's grown into a type of avatar for the Seeker, a timeless universal quest for no less than union with the divine. Remove the language of early 20th century mysticism, and we may even see shades of people we know today in Norah's story. Part of her appeal is that Norah Fornario is a highly sympathetic and, yes, familiar figure, a difficult start to life and an all-encompassing, dogged desire to connect with something beyond this earthly plane. In St. Oran's graveyard, Norah's bones now lie forever amongst the kings. Drawn to the island's legends, she ended up contributing to them herself. You'll find her under a simple, unassuming slab which reads MEF, Marie Emily Fornario. And I'll give the final word to former friend Dion Fortune, who had the following to say about Norah's death on that November night.
She had evidently been on an astral expedition from which she never returned. She was not a good subject for such experiments. Whether she was the victim of a psychic attack, whether she merely stopped out on the astral too long and her body, of poor vitality in any case, became chilled lying thus exposed in midwinter, or whether she slipped into one of the elemental kingdoms that she loved, who shall say?
You've been listening to Folkways, the Folklore of Britain and Ireland podcast, written and produced by myself, Ashley Hurren. Connect with the show on Instagram at FolkwaysPod. The incredible music was especially scored for this episode by Big Sky. Find his work on streaming platforms and socials at big.big.sky. If you think preserving this work is a worthwhile endeavour, please consider joining the Friends of Folkways, in return receiving show notes to episodes, bonus sections, letters in the post, icebreaker meditation and giveaways. You'll also get a file with downloadable soundtracks by Big Sky, as well as individual show episodes. Perfect for going offline, but also since they're large uncompressed WAV files for enjoyment in the highest quality. Membership to the Friends is extremely accessible, starting from only £2 a month. Thank you for your support. This episode, I have a bonus section specifically looking at Norah Fornario's death within the context of fairy folklore. Norah's life is often covered in the genre of strange, unexplained mysteries, but I thought it might be interesting for the Friends to look at it in relation to the she. I touched on this at the end of this episode, but let's look a little closer. Within the next week, you'll receive an email from me with a private link to enjoy.